Hello everyone, it's Scott, and we're back for day 5 of Bloomburrow spoiler season, and we've got a lot of interesting cards to talk about today. But before we do, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow spoiler season. And later on this week, I'll be doing some top 10 lists of what I think are the best cards for standard for the set. So let's dive into today's previews. So first we've got Rotten Mouth Viper for 5 and a black mana. You get an elemental snake. And as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent sacrificed this way. So you can, in essence, ramp into this by sacrificing permanents that are non-lands. And whenever Rotten Mouth Viper enters or attacks, put a blight counter on it. Then, for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. And our elemental snake is a 6/6. So this to me is kind of potentially a top end to a black deck. Potentially one where you're going to have tokens that are just going to be created throughout the course of the game that you can then sacrifice to get out Rotten Mouth Viper earlier than turn 6, because once you get there, then every turn your opponent is going to have to either lose 4 life or sacrifice a permanent or discard a card to deal with Rotten Mouth Viper's abilities. And I think that makes it the top end potentially of a black deck in standard. Next we've got Kitsa, Otter Ball Elite. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a legendary creature. That's an Otter Wizard. It's a 1/3 with Vigilance and Prowess. So Vigilance makes this, I think, an even better card because you'll be able to block with it as well. And it also has the ability to draw a card and then discard a card. And then for 2 mana, you can tap it and copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Activate only if Kitsa's power is 3 or greater. So basically what they're saying there is you're going to have to cast at least 2 spells or put some +1/+1 counters on Kitsa to get to that ability. And I don't think that really matters a lot. I think the ability to simply attack with this and it stays untapped and you get your normal prowess triggers on it. And then on your opponent's turn, you can draw and discard that card by activating the discarded draw ability. So I think this is a definite inclusion in our prowess deck that looks to get a very solid is it design to it. I think at this point, because of all the blue otters that I think fit into this now. So I'm really interested to see where this otter deck goes in standard. Next, we've got Stormbreaker. For 3 and a red mana, you get a Otter Wizard. That's a 1/4 with haste. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a token that's a copy of Stormbreaker. Exile that token at the beginning of your next end step. So this is, to me, a really interesting card. It's either going to be really good or really bad. And they've made it a mythic rare, so that leads me to believe at least Wizards think this is going to be a good card, because you're creating a copy of it. So each instant of sorcery, you're going to be creating a copy of it, and then you'll start creating copies of the copies as you continue to cast instants and sorceries throughout the course of that particular turn. So I can see some situations where you've got 4 mana and you're able to cast 2 or 3, maybe even 4 spells on a particular turn. And the end result of that is now you've got this army of Stormbreakers, and that probably is enough to deal a lot of damage to your opponent. And because of that, I think this has got some standard playability. Whether it's part of the Otter deck that I think is going to be in Izzet colors, I think that's a to be determined, but I like where this card is potentially going for us. Next, we move on to our rabbits for the day, and the first is Paw Patch Recruiter for 1 green mana. You get a 2/1 with Offspring 2, and you may pay an additional 2 as you cast this spell. If you do, When this creature enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 token copy of it. It has trample, and whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than that creature. So this to me is a really powerful card in Standard. Basically, we've already seen with the Poison Rot Priest deck in Standard the ability of just being able to target yourself with stuff and good things happen. So I think with Pawpath Recruit, we've got the same situation, but instead of giving poison counters out, we're giving +1/+1 counters out instead. And because of that, I really like where this card is going, and I think the Rabbit deck may be very solid. Next, we've got Valley Minecaller. For a green mana, you get a Frog Warrior. That's a 1/1 with trample, and whenever another frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Valley Minecaller. So we've had cards like this before that just grow as you have more cards enter the battlefield, and normally those are pretty good cards in Standard. So right now, between the Frog Warrior and the Pawpath Recruiter, I think those are two good cards that not necessarily go together, but they could, because frogs and rabbits work together in Standard. And I really like where we're going to be going with this deck potentially, where you've got a lot of 1 and 2 cost creatures that when they enter the battlefield they cause a trigger of some kind, and I think that's going to be a very interesting deck to play in Standard. Next, we've got Lunar Convocation. For a white and a black mana, you get an enchantment, and at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. So simply, you gain life from a creature, you get life. Your opponent is going to then lose life. And at the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying, and you can make sure that your life total changes this turn by playing 1 and a black mana and 2 life, and you get to draw a card. So I think this is a card really designed most likely to go into our bat deck in Standard, because we know that there are a number of cards already as part of that deck that have lifelink. So you're likely to be gaining life regularly. So that means that you're going to activate at least the second ability and create those bat tokens. And we've also talked about the fact that we have a number of cards from the set that just care about tokens. And I think this could be one of the quality token generators from the set. So I think this is going to definitely see some Standard play. Next, we've got Jackdaw Savior. For 2 and a white mana, you get a Bird Cleric. It's a 3/1 with flying. And whenever Jackdaw Savior or another creature you control with flying dies, return another target creature with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So very powerful ability on Jackdaw Savior, where basically if anything dies and you already have something in your graveyard, you're going to be able to bring something back that has less mana value than the card that was killed on that particular turn. And there is no limitation on this either. If you notice that, it just they have to die, and it has to be a creature with flying. So in a bird deck, in a bat deck, I think this is a nice inclusion there, because you're going to be able to lose cards like this and other cards throughout the course of a game, and you're just going to continue to recycle cards and put them onto the battlefield. And the nice thing about these cards, there's no finality counter on it or something like that. They just come back. And because of that, I think this is going to see a lot of play in Standard, if for no other reason. It's a 3/1 with flying and that ability to, again, bring something back when a creature dies with flying. Next, we've got our first reprint of the day, and that's Fabled Passage. This was originally in Throne of Eldraine, and what Fabled Passage does is you sacrifice Fabled Passage, you search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Then, if you control 4 or more lands, untap that land. So basically, the way this card worked was you would have a couple copies of it in your deck, and then you would hopefully not have to play it before turn 4. But when you did on turn 4, you just played it. It's now going to have that card come in untapped, that swamp or mountain or whatever is going to come in untapped, and then you just go about your business. So it basically is in the mid game, a mana fixing engine, because what you're able to do is go get whatever color of mana you need at that particular time. And what this is particularly going to be good for are our multicolored decks, where we want to be able to go get a basic land of a particular color because we need an extra black mana, we need an extra red mana for some reason. Let me go get that. And Fabled Passage is going to serve that purpose, and it's a lot of play in Standard in the 2 years that it was legal previously, so I expect it to see a lot of play going forward. Next, we've got some lower rarity cards I think are going to have some impact on Standard. So the first is Seasoned Warding Guard. For a white mana, you get a Rabbit Warrior, that's a 1/2, and whenever Seasoned Warding Guard attacks while you control a token, Seasoned Warding Guard gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So in the past couple of videos, I've talked about the fact that we have white cards that create rabbit tokens. And we know we have the Offspring ability. So I think creating tokens won't be a real difficult thing for us. So basically for 1 mana, you're going to get a 3/2 most of the time because of all of the tokens you're going to be able to create throughout the course of a game. And I think a 1 mana 3/2, that's pretty powerful in Standard. Next, we've got Hazel's Nocturne. For 3 and a black mana, you get an instant, and you get to return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, and each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So I don't really think this is Standard playable, but if in a limited setting you get this, I think this is a very good limited card because it's a drain and gain spell on top of getting creature cards back from your graveyard that you might need to win the game. So definitely limited playable. Next, we've got Sinister Monolith. For 3 and a black mana, you get an artifact, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And you can tap it and pay 2 life and sacrifice Sinister Monolith to draw 2 cards, activate only as a sorcery. So again, this is a card probably more geared towards limited, where if I got this in my limited pool, I would definitely want to take this because I don't need to do anything to have my opponent lose life and me gain life every single turn. And that tends to be a really good ability when we're talking about limited decks. Next, we've got Thoughtstalker Warlock. For 2 and a black mana, you get a Lizard Warrior. That's a 2/2 with Menace. And when Thoughtstalker Warlock enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, they reveal their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, and they discard a card. Otherwise, they discard a card. So Thoughtstalker Warlock, if you cast it in your second main phase and you've done combat damage to your opponent, you get to choose which card your opponent is going to discard. Otherwise, they just discard a card. So to me, this is a card that probably, because black has so many strong creatures, doesn't really see Standard playability. But in limited, again, it's another quality card because hand disruption is really powerful in limited. So I think this is a card that definitely will see limited play. And I think there's an outside shot if we have a deck built around discarding cards that this could easily slot in there as well. Next, we've got a couple red cards from today, and the first is Reptilian Recruiter. For 3 and 2 red mana, you get a Lizard Warrior. That's a 4/2 with Trample. So on the baseline stats, not great, certainly not worth 5 mana, but when Reptilian Recruiter enters, choose target creature if that creature's power is 2 or less, or if you control another lizard, gain control of that creature until end of turn, untap it, and it gains haste until end of turn. So the only way I would ever play this card in standard is in a lizard deck, so I know I would get the activation, because this is, an ability for you to go steal the best card on your opponent's side. That's a creature, and you get to use it for 1 turn. You get to attack with it, and if it dies in combat, so be it. Who cares? Because you're getting value out of it, because you're being able to attack with it. So in limited, I really like this card, and I think there's some potential playability in standard, because we have that ability to take a creature from your opponent for a turn and use it to attack with it. It might see some standard play. Next, we've got War Squawk for a red mana. You get an enchantment. That's an aura, and it's an enchant creature. When War Squawk enters, target creature an opponent controls can't block this turn. So first thing it enters play, one of your opponent's creatures can't block, and then the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has haste. So one of the downsides to the Otter deck that I see right now that probably will form an Izzet, or the Izzet Prowess deck, probably a better way of calling it that, is there are going to be Otters in there that do not have Prowess. I mean, we just know that's going to happen because the quality Otters that have Prowess don't have haste in blue. So this is a way to give those blue creatures that have Prowess the ability of haste. And I think because of that, this is going to see play in that deck in standard. And in limited, again, nice spell to have, because you get that buff of +1/+1. You can tell one of your opponent's creatures it can't block, and then whatever creature you cast in that mid to late game, that's a big creature, now it's got haste and it can attack right away. Next, we've got a couple of green creatures for the day, and our first is Bushy Bodyguard for 1 and a green mana. You get a Squirrel Warrior. That's a 2/1. It has Offspring of 2, and you may pay an additional 2 mana as you cast this spell. If you do, when this creature enters the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 token copy of it, and when this creature enters the battlefield, you may forage. If you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So if you can forage, and I think that's the key. If you are going to be able to forage when you cast this, 2 mana for a 4/3 is outstanding. So in that circumstance, I think this is a very good standard card. 4/3 for 2 mana, pretty awesome. But I wouldn't put 4 copies of this in a standard deck, because the likelihood of being consistently able to forage every time you cast this, I think, is pretty low. And because of that, I think it's not going to see 4 copies of in a Squirrel deck or a green deck in standard, but a couple copies I think are reasonable. Next, we have Hazard Root Herbalist for 2 and a green mana. You get a Rabbit Druid. That's a 1/4. And whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. If that creature is a token, it also gains Death Touch until end of turn. So we've got a lot of cards that say something about being targeted, that Valiant ability, and this is one of the cards that's going to initiate that Valiant ability in standard. So because of that, I think this is going to get played in our Rabbit deck. And if we have kind of a Super Friends deck around the creature types of Bloomburrow, I think this will be in that one as well, because it's going to trigger those abilities on mice and other cards that you have in your deck. All right, our last card of the day is Patchwork Banner for 3 mana. You get an artifact, and as Patchwork Banner enters the battlefield, you get to choose a creature type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So normally I wouldn't think very much out of this card, because it's basically a mana rock if you look at it. But I think the upside of giving all of your creatures of a particular type +1/+1. So if we put this in a soldier deck, okay, all of your creatures get +1/+1 and you get additional mana. So I think taking a turn off to do that is reasonable in standard. And we already are seeing in the Atraxa deck, the Cornucopia, from the bonus sheet from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, seeing a lot of play because it's giving you life for every color of mana you're using. So I think this potentially does have that same kind of playability in standard. All right, those were our previews for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I think we are at that point of the season where I can say I think Bloomburrow is going to go down as a very powerful overall set because we've got a lot of powerful cards in it. And the key thing about that to me is the most important is they're at low cost. It's 1, 2, maybe 3 mana at max for powerful cards that'll go into standard. And one of the things that I've learned over the course of the years is the best cards you're going to end up playing, okay, are typically going to be 3 mana or less. So because of that, I'm excited to see where Bloomburrow brings us in standard because I think there's going to be a lot of mid-range / aggro decks / tribal decks that come out of this set. And as we see previews over the next couple of days, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing the chance for a couple of other of our creature types to have the ability to have a tribal deck. All right, so remember that I'll be doing some preview videos later on this week that are top 10 list, and remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Bloomburrow season and beyond. And thanks for staying to the end of the video, and I put some links to a couple of videos from earlier in the season if you haven't had a chance to take a look at those. So thanks. I'll see you next time.